Many of you know Father James Griner. Father Griner is a priest of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, but grew up here in Stillwater and has an amazing history, both personally and then going back in his family. And so what we thought, as a little part of our celebration of the 6th anniversary, we thought we would just do a little fireside chat without the fire. But I'm gonna just throw out a few questions to Father Greiner and let him just tell an amazing history of Catholics here in Payne County. There's been a lot of triumphant moments, a lot of really difficult moments. There's been some persecution along the way. And I just think it's good for all of us, no matter your age. Maybe you've been in Stillwater forever and ever and ever. Maybe you're just brand new. Some families that are here have moved here just in the last year. It's good for us to know our history. So would you join me in welcoming Father Jim Greiner? Yes, indeed. All right. Here we go. So I'm just going to ask questions and pass the mic off. Father Greiner, if you would, just start by telling us how you became a priest.
That's easy. I was ordained.
Hold it up close.
I'm only 86 at the present time, and I thought about being a priest only 80 years ago. So I was 6 years old at the time, and at that time when I got my start in life at Oklahoma City, my parents, Austin and Lois, got married. My mother, Lois, was still a member of the Church of Christ. Her father, my grandfather on that side, Will Thompson, was the head of the Church of Christ in Tuttle, and her 4 brothers were all members of the Church of Christ. So when Dad first met Mom, and they had a date or two, Mother asked my dad, Austin, you know, I told my father that I met you. And Dad said, oh, how'd that go? She said, well, he told me to stop it because that priest and the church will lead him straight to hell. So she said, I told Austin that, and so that's why when we got married, we ran off to the Justice of the Peace and came back 2 weeks later to get the marriage blessed by the father of our parish at Holy Angels. The pastor of Holy Angels at that time was Father James Arthur Garvey. I was born on the 21st of December of 1937, baptized 5 days later on December 25th, and the name that I was given was James Arthur Griner, after the pastor, Father James Arthur Garvey. While we lived there for about 5 years, before we moved to a farm 13 miles east and a mile north of Marlow. At that time, our pastor was from Duncan, Father George Fangauer. We also had missions of Marlow and Rush Springs. Marlow and Rush Springs would have Mass every other Sunday, always a Mass on Sunday in Duncan. Our pastor was Father George Fangauer, and the one that I remember best and encouraged me very young to become a priest. Father George Fangauer had been the confessor to the Emperor of Austria until Adolf Hitler said, kill the Emperor and kill that priest. He escaped in the trunk of an automobile while they were firing at them.
Wow.
Wound up ultimately in Duncan. I spent 2 weeks down with the family in Duncan because we lived that far away from the parish, while Father Fangauer and the 2 nuns were giving us instructions for our first confessions and First Communion. So I received First Confession and Communion there at Duncan. In Marlow, Father came by shortly, a couple of weeks after all of that, and he said, Jimmy, come back and serve. Well, Marlow was a very small wooden church. I thought it was pretty big at my age. And I said, no. So in the meantime, he talked to my dad. So 2 weeks later, he comes by and gets behind the collar, grabs me behind the collar. Come with me, Jimmy. We went back to the sacristy, put a black thing on like that kid and a white thing over it, just like him, and just follow him. I said, okay. Because he was the only kid old enough to serve in the parish. Well, we go out to the altar, and Father begins, of course, Mass in Latin. He's back to the people. And he goes up and checks everything on the altar, comes down and starts. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Introibo ad altare Dei. And the kids started saying stuff. Well, I'd heard him say stuff before, so I figured every time he paused, I said stuff. Well, so when we finished Mass, before we finished Mass, we went over to change the epistle over to the gospel side, and I'm right with that kid, whom I thought, now this guy's a disaster. Hi, he's down here, you're not supposed to be here. And he said, follow you. So I followed that poor kid all during Mass. On the way home, my father said, Jimmy, there are real Latin words, and we're going to learn them between now and next time. So I got my job as a server at age 7 in Marlow. And Father Vangar, we would go to Mass at midnight in Duncan, and we went over to his home afterwards. He invited my parents and I over, my brother Walter, and he gave me an altar. It was about 14 inches long, about 6 inches deep, about 9 or 10 inches high, had a plain cross and plain candles on it, and a cord coming out the back end of it. I looked at it, and Father looked at me, and he said, Jimmy, is there something wrong? I said, yeah, Father, we don't have any electricity. He said, well, you will someday, but keep thinking about being a priest. So really, a lot of inspiration from him during that time, as well as he also made sure that we kids, since we live so far away from the church, that he gave it to all the children, copies of Treasure Chest. At that time, it was kind of like a comic book, and it had all kinds of stories in it about our doctrine, our history, lives of the saints, etc. So we would take that home. And then for religious ed, my mother was great at teaching at home, and we always prayed together at home. We only missed one Mass while we were living there for those 5 years. That's when Mother forgot to drain the water out of the car, and it froze up 4 miles from home, and we didn't make it to Mass. But that was the only time. And it was a great time. The nuns also, we would do correspondence course with the sisters that operated out of Calumet, Oklahoma. So on Sunday afternoons, we would be at home filling out the questionnaires to send back to them. The nuns would grade it and then put comments on it and write notes to us and send them back. So it was a great time, but that was a time where I was thinking about priesthood. Then we moved after 5 years up to Enid, Oklahoma, and we were there for 5 years. A lot of things happened at Enid. And then we moved to the farm 5 miles south of Stillwater in 1950. The Greiner family has been here for ages of ages. My grandfather, well, let's go back to my great-grandfather. Great-grandfather, and you can tell they were Catholic, his name was Peter Paul. And he was one of 12 children. His father had come over from Alsace-Lorraine. They were Alsatians. And later on, Peter Paul marries Amelia, my great-grandmother, and she was from Germany. They lived around near Michigan, and then later moved down into Kansas, and finally in Oklahoma. And grandfather Greiner, Alphonse, was one of 13 children from Peter Paul. My grandfather, Alphonse, was his 4th child. Peter Pius, or Pius Mary, was the 8th child, and Angela was the 10th child among that 13. We have other relatives here in Stillwater still. 2 of my cousins are still members here at St. Francis. Carol, Greiner, Powell, and I was trying to think of the other is Sally Greiner Jones. Carol Ann was from Katie's family, Kenneth and his wife, and Sylvia is John Greiner's children. So those two cousins are still here. And
What year was that? The Alphonse was in and around Stillwater. What year?
well, first Alphonse, my grandfather, with his dad, made a run for land down near Edmond first and staked out a very poor farm. And so also my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Pius, had, Peter Paul rather, had a little bit of a drinking problem too. So my grandfather Alphonse also got a job working on the railroad to help with the family expenses and help them out. At the same time, Pius went to learn how to make harness while they lived at Edmond. We wound up in Stillwater later because grandfather made the land run in Cherokee Territory in 1889 and staked a farm near Perry. He met two other guys at that stake. The stake had burned off some. These two guys were arguing over who should own that property because all three of them got there at the same time. Grandfather planned to stake a farm 2 miles from there, but he had practiced with his horse only going from home to the post office and back every day, not thinking it was a longer run. His horse got tired. That's why he staked it where he was. And he said, I saw the minister and the cowboy arguing, and the cowboy finally let the minister have that property. Grandfather said, that was a mistake. That preacher was the worst neighbor we ever had. But that's how he wound up here in the Stillwater area. Grandfather also planted all the trees in the square at Perry, way back when. And while they were here, we were being served, as you might know, hopefully many of you know, from the priest coming to Stillwater, which wasn't very large at the time, and coming from Guthrie, Father Dupre, to serve us from there, where Bishop Mearshart lived. And then Perry was given charge of Stillwater and missions as well. So during that time, when Mass would be held here in Stillwater occasionally, it would be in a parishioner's home. So sometimes it was in the Jardo home. And occasionally it was also in A.M. Griner, my grandfather's home. Grandfather's house is still there, the one he lived in, which is just 2 blocks north of the old St. Francis. Occasionally, Bishop Mearshart would come to town for confirmations. He also sometimes would have a little problem because he and the priest with him crossed over the Cimarron River, and they had a problem. They had to get out of the carriage and walk through waist-high water, carrying everything over their heads, and finally made it to Stillwater. So he came down to A.M. Griner, my grandfather's house, to clean up and then go to St. Francis and do confirmations. The people, and wasn't the only Greiners that were here as well. Angela, my aunt, his sister, Angela Cooper, lived straight across the street from the rectory. And then her kids were all related to the Coopers as well. But they wanted to have a church badly here in Stillwater. They got a women's group together like women have always done and still do. They're the backbone of the church. And they prepared meals and served things to get money, and they worked their tails off. It was a hard time. People were poor. They finally got enough money to build that first church.
What year was that around?
That was about 90, I can't remember exactly.
Early 1900s.
Early 1900s.
Early
yeah.
1900s, okay.
Yeah. And they finally built the first church. He got enough money together that they could build it. It cost $640. You might think that's funny, but back then that was like thousands today.
Yeah.
They built the first church. The priest would come and have occasional Mass in that first church. It was 30 feet by 40 feet. The pews were just planks placed on the top of nail keg barrels. Finally, they also, when the first priest came as a regular pastor, there was no real place for him. Grandfather was able to get the people together enough to get $250 to add a little back part on the church behind the sacristy. It was later on down the line that there was a West Point church east of town here. And when that one went under, then West Point Church and their altar, etc., was brought here to Stillwater and added on to that wooden church. When my family would come to visit from our farm at Marlow and elsewhere, we were able to go to Mass in that old wooden church. When my immediate family, Austin, Lois, my mother and father, my brother Walter, and my brother Michael moved here in 1950, they'd already were tearing down the old church, and Lambert and Company were building the present old St. Francis. My father's only complaint about what they were doing in building that church. Why are they blasting all that rock and make that basement that deep? They could just build that church a little bit higher. Well, they blasted all that rock out. They built that basement, and the only problem it had was the drains from the bathroom in the basement were higher than the sewer line at the street. They had to remedy that over the centuries. But there were also, in addition, other priests besides me here at this parish in Stillwater in the past. See if I've left anything out there. Notes help a memory. Okay. In those early days, too, Catholics were not very numerous in Oklahoma. We weren't very numerous back in 1950 even. The Beard was 3.2, and we had less than that number of population of Catholics in the state of Oklahoma. So we've gotten better since then. But anyway, trying to think. But all the people that came, there's some pictures here that showed all the people at one of the wooden churches, the old one with all the additions, shows a lot of people out in front of it. Well, that was the whole parish gathered for that picture at that time.
Wow.
Okay. Also, Grandfather Griner was very involved in all kinds of civic things here in the community as well. He was hired on to help in building Boomer Dam so that the city of Stillwater would have enough water, was the idea. As a superintendent, I think he made maybe $2 a month or something to be the supervisor. But he was involved in many other things as well. And Catholics weren't welcome in Oklahoma in many ways. In fact, even we Catholics had a hard time getting Mass wine. When we first came, all liquor was prohibited. So we could not get Mass wine in. When Mass wine came in, they took it away from the train. Father Urban de Hask was a canon lawyer and also a civil lawyer, and he had them send it to him. And then he was able to deal with the state of Oklahoma and get Mass wine authorized to be given to the Catholics of Oklahoma for their services.
Wow.
So it was an interesting time.
Wow.
Yeah. Also, the Ku Klux Klan was active. They were causing a lot of problems for us Catholics. They also didn't like my grandfather. One day, Grandfather was warned, the Klan is coming to your house tonight. So Grandfather was prepared. He was at that house that's just 2 blocks north of the church. They're marching down the street. Grandfather's on the front porch, sitting in his chair with his rifle across his legs. The Klan begins to come to the corner to turn, and Grandfather could recognize 2 people because he knew their boots. And he called them by name and said, you get the hell out of here and go home and behave yourselves. They saw his gun, they heard his admonition, and the Klan turned and went home.
Wow.
So he kind of stood fast for some of those things,
What was if I could borrow that?
Sure.
So talking about like the KKK, what was their What was their problem with Catholics? I think a lot of times we associate KKK with being very racist and anti-Jewish. And what was the KKK's problem with Catholics, and how did that manifest itself?
Well, I don't know how it started, but the KKK hated Catholics as much as anyone else.
Yep.
And so they would burn crosses in some of the yards, kill some of our people, and caused all kinds of problems all the time.
Wow.
So my grandfather, he wound up having only several kids. His oldest was Agnes, my aunt, who never got married. And she, for a long time, lived in what she taught in Indian schools to start with, wound up as a teacher at Emerson Junior High in Enid. His two other children that he had died very early. In fact, one of them was so small that they didn't have incubators at that time, so they had to place that child with the door to the stove open to get some heat to it.
Wow.
That child didn't last very long. The other child, Walter, died very, very young as well. Their third child was my father, Austin, followed by Kenneth, then John, and then the only child he had by his second wife, Clara. Soon as Loyola, my grandmother, gave birth to John, it was just a few months later, she had stepped on a nail working in her garden and got poisoned and died. Grandfather, after a little while, thought, it's not right to raise these kids, we need to have a mother as well. He had known Clara when they were at Mount Clemens, Michigan. She was then out in San Francisco. He told his daughter Agnes, watch the kids, I'll be back sometime soon. He went to San Francisco and married her and brought her home. By Clara, he had one son, Al. So the Greiner family began to continue. Okay. In my own case, of course, we had just my brother Walter, Michael, and myself. And when and I'm a Perkins demon as well, for those of Perkins. I was and still am. And they tried to get rid of demons here a few years ago, that logo. But we resisted and we won. We said, we're good demons. We're not bad demons. So anyway, I went to school the last part of 7th grade and 8th grade at the grade school there in Perkins. I had no idea in the 8th grade that there was a race for valedictorian salutatorian. I had 4 teachers. One of our teachers was Mrs. Tomlinson. She was a member of Church of Christ here in Stillwater. There were only 2 Catholics in Perkins at the time. One was named James Arthur Greiner, and the other Walter Greiner, 3 years younger. Well, we had been in class in the 8th grade about a month and a half, which they had a survey to find out what we were going to be, finding out mainly, are you going to stay on the farm or not? I was number 35 in the row. She got to me last and said, Jimmy, what do you want to be? I said, well, ma'am, it's between 2 things. I'd like to be a priest, but if not, a brain surgeon. So she wrote that down. And it was about 2 months later, they had another survey. Came around and I gave the same answers, but she was also our math teacher. Suddenly, I wasn't able to get answers from her about math, or I would turn in a paper and she said, I would say, this was right. You put it down as wrong. Oh, you erased that. I said, I erased that at home before I brought it up here and handed it to you a while ago. Well, in January, finally, Mrs. Russell, one of our teachers, called Mom and Dad and said, could I see you? Could you come down? Because I don't think Jimmy knows what's going on, and you don't know what's going on. So Mrs. Russell told them, the Perkins School Board has met because the Catholic kid, your son, is a wee bit ahead of the girl for valedictorianship. And they've decreed he's not to get it. And so at the end of that year, I was told by that same teacher, she used to be a Catholic years ago and hated Catholics immensely. Well, I would turn in papers after that. I saw what was happening. We'd milk the cows. I'd do my homework in pencil. Then I'd redo it in pen without any mistakes. Take it up to her and say, "Ma'am, do you mind changing this? The grade is wrong." She would change it. "Do you mind changing it in that green book of yours at the same time?" Well, she did. So at the end, I knew that I was going to go off to the seminary come September, graduating in May. And we graduated at that time in the old gymnasium. All the bleachers were full, chairs on the floor were full, school board and all's behind you on the stage, and the teachers in the front row. Well, I made my speech. At that time, you could say something more than, "Thank you very much, it's been good to be here." I wrote mine on prejudice. Mom took a look at that and said, "That's good, son. Let me help you calm it down just a hair." I was surprised she kept that speech. In fact, I found it, and after she had her, right before she had her major stroke, she showed me that. And also she said, "I don't know that you know, but your father didn't want you going off to ninth grade seminary." So mother having been secretary to veterinary medicine for 20 years, my dad simply told her, as he often did, "Lois, take dictation, write this down. Write down what I tell you." So he wrote a letter to Father George Fangar in Duncan. And he said, "I don't think this kid should be going off at ninth grade, but whatever you say, Father, that's what we'll do." I saw the letter back from Father George that said, "Austin, let him go in ninth grade. If he's not to be a priest, he'll be home sometime soon. If so, he'll be a priest." That's the only reason Dad let me go in ninth grade. I got up to give that speech at graduation. That teacher that hated Catholics is in the front row in a red dress. My dad had caught me practicing for 2 weeks because she had changed my speech to where it said nothing. Late one night, Dad said, "What are you doing in the bathroom this late at night?" Looking at the mirror. I'm giving her speech, which she demands in class, and that night I'm giving mine. That night I gave my speech on prejudice. And interestingly enough, maybe most of the town knew something else. The entire bunch stood and clapped. I got my grades in August from the principal to send off to the seminary at St. Francis, Oklahoma City. And I said, "Sir, you made a mistake." "Well, no, you really were the valedictorian. It's no mistake." I said, "Well, thank you very much." I started seminary at ninth grade at the old seminary at Bethany, right off of Highway 66. And at that time, there was a big mound right out beside. You had a big mound that looked like an upside-down bread pan. Father James Garvey, the head of Catholic Charities, had going to make a national monument to St. Joseph right off of Highway 66 to try to pull in enough money to help with the orphanage next door, Our Lady's of Victory, Home for Unwed Mothers, and all that stuff. Well, he died before it could be completed. While I was in seminary, of course, there were 2 rumors about what's in that big hill there. Well, we could go get a haircut in town right before we would come home at Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Easter. In the meantime, Father Stieferman, who was a year ahead of me, was our barber, and I became a barber after Stieferman, Father Stieferman. Well, we could cut hair in that basement of that house where we lived, and it looked pretty good under a light bulb. You'd take them outside, it didn't look too good. But we practiced and worked at it. Well, the rumor was, when we go to town, don't tell the barber in town any. He's the head of the elders, and he spreads stories, so don't give him any stories. What they said was in that hill, those are the children that the priests have by those nuns that run the orphanage, and they knock them in the head and bury them in that hill. The other story was, when the Pope finally says to take over the United States, that's where they keep their ammunition, and we know that they have a lot of missiles in their churches. Well, that was spread around for a while, so interesting period of time. So I spent the 3 years there, freshman, sophomore, and junior, at Minor Seminary, Old St. Francis, Bethany. Then they had to send us somewhere else for seminary training. And then I was sent to St. John Seminary, San Antonio, Texas, senior year. 4 years at Assumption Seminary in San Antonio, at which time also Stanley Rother, Blessed Stanley Rother, at that time just Stanley Rother, was 2 years ahead of me in school there. So got to know Stanley very well. And one of our classmates, it's kind of an interesting thing with saints, they're just like us, they're very human. Stanley was also in charge of cleaning one of the restrooms at St. Alice Hall. One of my classmates, Michael Irwin, would always go to the bathroom, which he didn't have to, in full cassock. He would enthrone himself on the throne, full cassock, read, smoke, and eventually use the throne. He came out one day and said to Stan, "You could clean this thing better, Stan," and we left. 2 days later, Stan came back. Michael is enthroned, and Stan has with him a large gallon jar with stuff that looks like tea. He got in the stall next to Michael, gingerly poured that down to flow under Michael's shoes. Michael thought it was something else. Stan left, and he never found out who did it. But finally when I was ordained, I went to Rome for the last 4 years of theology. Father Joe Dillon, of course, was a pastor here at one time for a short time. He also was educated in Rome, and he came by to visit me several times at North American College. Bishop Reed, of course, was pastor here as Monsignor Reed many years ago at Old St. Francis. Later became our bishop. Eric Beavers was the pastor when my family, Austin, Lois, Walter, and myself, and Mike, came here in 1950. And the new church was being built at that time. Father Beavers was very quick with many things. I would only be home for the summers from seminary, working on the farm, etc. I came into Old St. Francis one Saturday afternoon, and a lot of folks weren't going to confession at the time, so there wasn't lines or a lot of people. Father Beavers is in the choir loft sweeping. "Hello, Jim. I'll be down in a minute." So he comes back down. We're in the three-hole confessional on the south side. He comes in, we start off. I gave my sins, he gave me a penance. I said my act of contrition. When I finished my act of contrition, I came out of the door and he was still sweeping back up in the choir loft. Rather speedy, he finished his part and left and went up to the choir. We could also go to midnight mass at St. Francis, which would be a solemn high mass with celebrant, deacon, subdeacon, the whole works. Father would preach, it was all in Latin. He was very nice. It didn't sound like he was going so fast with Latin, but he was speedy. He never could wait till midnight. He'd start 2 minutes before midnight. We would finish mass at midnight, and our family would be home at the farm eating breakfast at 1:20. He was fast.
Wow.
But a great guy. He was very encouraging and a nice priest. The priest I got to know really well was Father Bernard Loftus. He came here with his two sisters, blood sisters, Nora and Kathleen. Kathleen taught kindergarten. Nora was the housekeeper. And so I got to know Father very well. And at the end of summertime, the priest would always, no matter who was pastor of St. Francis, would invite a seminarian to come in and have dinner with them. I came in one night and probably, not sure what I was, at that time about a senior in high school, and then I had just finished 4 years at Assumption, San Antonio. When I got to the door and rang that bell in the rectory, I could smell that stuff. I said, "Oh my, we're going to eat really well. Nora's done a great job. So I came in, the table was set for Kathleen, Nora, Father, and myself. We just sat down to eat and the doorbell rang. Father Loftus went to the door, answered it. We could hear him talking to a gentleman for about 5 minutes. He came back around the corner of the dining room and he said, Nora, set another place. So he invited the man to eat with us. We sat there and ate. And when we finished, this man who was an itinerant passing through, he said, it's been a long time since I've been able to sit down with people and visit. And you've shared your lives with me and your food, and it's been terrific. Thank you so much. And then he left. My thought as a seminarian at the time is, my pastor is a whole lot like Jesus. And he was that way in so many ways. Later, he became pastor at St. James Parish in Oklahoma City. After I was ordained and came back home in 1964, my ordination in Rome was December the 18th of 63, and came home for Solemn High Mass at Old St. Francis on July the 19th of 1963. I asked my dad to check with the pastor, Father Payne. Dad, would you mind checking with him, see if he'll let you build a platform that goes over those bottom 2 steps to the altar, as I want to say Mass facing the people, which we can now. Dad checked with Father Payne, who said, okay. So Dad said, well, I got approval. When I came home, Father Pribble, Father Neighborhouse, and I are setting up that altar facing the people. And there's a monstrous pulpit up in the sanctuary. It's probably 3 feet wide, had to walk up 2 steps to get into it, bigger than that sanctuary required. And you could look down on the peons in the pew. I'm looking at Father Pribble and Neighborhouse. They have a funny look on their face when I said, can I move that? Father Pace had come in right behind me. Oh, hi, Father. Do you mind if I move that in that alcove? No, okay. So he let us move it. Father Pribble was rolling around on the ground laughing. Said in 2 weeks I was going to take an axe and chop that down and burn it. I don't think he ever did that, but it disappeared. So I had Mass, the first Mass there, Solemn High Mass, with Father Pace as called the archpriest at that time. And we had subdeacon and deacon, and Father Pribble was the narrator because everything was still in Latin. He could tell the people what's going on. And then we finished, Father Loftus was the preacher at the Mass. And he and I were very friendly. He was hoping that I would be his associate pastor at St. James in Oklahoma City. Well, I was hoping so too. But on August the 1st, he died, and Father Wilkemeyer became the pastor instead. So a very great guy, wonderful guy. But most all the priests that were here in Stillwater that I met and knew were very helpful and kind. There were also other seminarians from this parish in the past. Father Robert McDowell was a convert of Bishop Reed while he was pastor here. And Father McDowell became a priest, was highly involved in the segregation issues of the time here in Oklahoma City and all, and was arrested a time or two for being involved in such a way. Graham Walters was Protestant early on in his family. Graham and his mother became Roman Catholic. Graham studied for the priesthood, and he was ordained just a little short time before me. And then myself. Others who had relatives in the parish were Father Ross and the Schatz and others. We also had Bishop Muggenberg had relatives in the parish. Mm-hmm. So we had all of those, several for vocations. We also had a couple that became nuns as well. So we've had a long history, but it was hard and tough for people way back when. But the Catholics were terrific, I think, here in Stillwater during that whole period of time. I know Father had asked me to.
Can I ask you one more?
Sure.
Just as a final question, your family's been around for a good long time. You've been around a little less, but a good long time.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say? We're celebrating our 6th anniversary in this church. What are your hopes for the Catholic community in Payne County for the next 5, 50, 100 years? What do you hope we become?
Well, not just our parish, but everybody.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, I'm a member of this parish, although I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, living here in the foreign diocese of Tulsa. I asked Bishop Condela only to help out at Stillwater when needed, because there are too few of us to help out for our guys at the Archdiocese. In fact, there's only 4 or 5 of us right now. So I fill in the Archdiocese about 35 weekends a year. I would hope that the growth that we see taking place at present will continue, and I think it will. And as far as the future goes for this parish and all parishes, I would hope that in the future that the church here and elsewhere can see clericalism totally destroyed, overcome. That the women of the church are given more discretion and recognition in leadership roles. That synodality, which is going on right now, and I hope is very flourishing at the end, because it should never end, will be something because we're learning how to listen to each other, pray with each other, share with one another, and participate in the life of the church and the mission that Jesus has given us. I think that will happen. Also, it would be nice in the future when the role of the pastor is down to doing pastoral ministry and not hampered so much by administration and other things. One of the retired priests had told me, "Father, when you retire, they're going to want you about 72 Sundays a year. There's only 52. So be sure you reserve some time for yourself," and which I've done. So when a priest calls and says, "Father, can you help me on these particular Sundays?" I look at my book and I say, "Oh, Father, I am so disappointed. That weekend I am booked." You don't have to tell him that you're deer hunting. just tell him that you're busy, because they'll want you as often as possible. And so I fill in about 35 weekends a year. But it would be great when, because he told me, this retired priest, after retirement you can actually do ministry, Father. So I have no administrative duties, no personnel, and I need to worship with God everywhere. So my hope is that all of us would continue to grow in our understanding of the church and the mission of Christ, to realize that every one of us, lay and priest, we're on the same journey to eternal life together. And that hopefully as a priest we could learn about our people very much so, and their gifts and talents, and help direct them toward using those talents in their best ways. So, laity, we're all in this together.
Oh, thank you, Father Griner. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome.
It's been very wonderful.
Thank you.
We're grateful for you.
Okay, thank you.